this is it. This is our last frontier of what it means to be human. And that's, of course, led me to the much broader set of questions of how do we think about the impact of technologies on our brain, not just from being able to decode what's there, but manipulate and change what's there. I am increasingly concerned about what does it mean for our capacity to think at all, let alone the privacy of what we think about.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We look at the big invisible forces that are sloshing around underneath us, grabbing at our ankles and trying to pull us out to sea if we're not careful. And when I tried to articulate one of the many iterations of this to a colleague when I was working in TV, I remember that producer saying to me, as I was describing this coming threat, he said, well, we're in the business of reporting on what's going on right now. You're talking about an imaginary thing that might happen in the future, but we do the news. And he was not wrong. That is totally right. But it really is a frustration, a difficulty for me as someone who thinks about and reports on the future implications of stuff, thinking about technology. And I have been, accused in the past of being a little too speculative, not just by that guy. Some people reading my book, The Loop, which was all about sort of trying to predict what AI was going to do to our sense of agency and to ourselves. People called it speculative. Turns out I was kind of right on, and I say that in all humility, because when I talk to this podcast's guest, you'll see that I was really thinking only a certain number of steps into the future. This is a person, Nita Farahany, professor of law at Duke University, who is thinking way out into the future. She's thinking about the degree to which companies are not just going to seek to shape our behavior, the way, analyze and shape it the way that I talk about in my book. She's thinking about the ways that they're going to analyze and shape our minds. The Battle for Your Brain, the book that she wrote in 2023, talks all about how there are hundreds of companies trying to do that. And she took it on the chin for years trying to think about this, but she was right. People are trying to get up against your skin to analyze what you're about. And in authoritarian regimes, as she'll describe to you, there are places in which people are really using that to control the population in ways that, we've seen that movie and it ends very badly. Now, not only is she thinking about that, she's gone on to think now in a new book that she's working on about the broader threat to our ability to think at all that technology poses. But unlike me, who likes to just roll around on the problem, she's someone who really thinks about solutions. She's an incredibly creative and hardworking person, and I hope you enjoy this hour-long conversation with Nita Farahany. So I just got back from Brazil. I've never been there before. I know you travel like crazy. Have you been to Brazil? Is that a trip you've taken?
I haven't. I'd like to go, but I haven't. Yeah.
So here's why. I was thinking about you because I knew we were going to have this conversation coming into this, and I was so interested in. You would have found it so interesting, and this is why. So Brazil, as you know, right, has this huge, long-time violent crime problem. They've had a huge amount of difficulty with that. At the same time, they also have had this really deepening relationship with China. And they're one of the poster children of China's exporting of their surveillance technology to other countries. So wow. China sells huge amounts of surveillance technology to the capital cities. They have this thing called the Smart Cities or Safe Cities program. They would sell cameras to Karachi, Pakistan, Quito, Ecuador. And then Rio, where I was, has bought tons of this stuff. So you walk around and there's just endless, you're photographed everywhere. I just got an email this morning from the car rental company saying, here's the speeding ticket you got at this time in this place. I have no idea where that was or when I was filmed. But there's this clear bargain that has been struck there between privacy and safety. I know you travel a lot, and I wonder just when you are out in the world and you're seeing the sort of bargain being struck between surveillance and safety. You go all over the world. What is it like for you to sort of observe this weird bargain and where we're at? And is the United States an outlier for you, or this is, I don't know, this is the question I wanted to put in front of you. Is how do you think about that stuff when you're out in the world?
Yeah, it's funny. I wrote this piece, 20 years ago now for the Washington Post about, brain tech. That was the first, brain tech one. And what I contrasted it with, or kind of to show the coming age of much broader surveillance, was the way in which in London they had installed video cameras everywhere, that there were video cameras in the like light bulbs and posts and everywhere in street kind of settings. And that was unusual at the time, right? That was like very, like they had moved to integrate surveillance technology in ways that just seemed like this giant panopticon in society. I don't think you can go anywhere now where there just isn't, including in the United States, video surveillance of everything you do everywhere. And of course, we're all carrying around pocket devices that surveil everything from our location data to what we're saying is they listen at all times with things like, Siri or Amazon Alexa or inside people's homes. So I don't think that the U.S. is an outlier so much, other than the extent to which people believe that state-based technology is being deployed for constant surveillance of everything that we do, versus other countries like China that makes it more explicit that it's all state-based surveillance. In the U.S., the government can just reach into companies and get them to share whatever data they want shared, or have a backdoor that's built into technology to enable every private listening device that every American seems to adopt willingly and put into their own homes, and just spy in on that technology rather than having to be explicit about it for the state. So, I think that the U.S. goes about it through a different channel, and perhaps it's even more insidious in that people don't think it's happening, but it is.
That's interesting, right? Because I mean, it's funny. I remember when I did this this documentary series for PBS called Hacking Your Mind, we were talking a lot about how when it's state-based and it's, if you slapped a national, a NSA logo onto like a Google Nest thermostat, you would drown that bitch in the bathtub. Like you would be so, you'd be so freaked out, right? But because because you bought it, it's somehow more American and okay. There's
and it's just this belief, like, maybe up until recently, where people talk about the current administration with different terminology, right? You hear people talking about, greater tyranny rising, or, kind of the rise of a different approach. And whether or not you believe that, that's maybe the first time that you really hear a much broader segment of the public in the United States fearing the kind of intervention by the state into everyday lives and into kind of a greater surveillance, and a greater maybe chilling of freedom of speech, or the comfort people have with freedom of speech. That is relatively new here, but not at all new in other countries that have long lived with that. And so I think in other countries, people recognize, that the very technology that they're using, whether or not it has a sticker slapped on it that says Chinese state installed this in your home, they recognize that any technology could be listening or could be used for facial recognition, or, they recognize that if they're demonstrating in public that, for a long time they needed to mask their faces because of the likelihood of being recognized. Whereas just recently in the United States, you start to see, students on college campuses wearing masks at protests, or recognizing the likelihood that technology could be used for surveillance purposes. So it's a shift in consciousness here, but it's still not complete, right? You still have people willingly putting listening devices into their homes. And of course, most of us carry around, the kind of perfect listening device at all times, which is our mobile devices, and we don't turn it into a non-listening mode whenever we're, out and about or having a sensitive conversation.
And I mean, so for people who don't know, right? So your book, The Battle for Your Brain, takes this idea one step further, I think, than most Americans have ever taken it, which is this idea not just that they are filming you and listening to you, but that they are pressed up against your skin and trying to get biometrics and actual mental activity out of you. And I wonder if, like, early on, it's funny, like you said, you wrote this piece on brain tech for the Washington Post. I would imagine that, like, I can imagine a Washington Post editor 20 years ago being like, okay, brain tech, yeah, hey, wackadoo, like, what are you talking about, right? Like, for you, how hard has it been to get people, I think you should define this idea
Yep.
and sort of the realm you were in. But I also want to know how hard it was to try to get people to take that seriously when you were first discussing it in your circles.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, the space that I've been focused on for a very long time now is what I say the interface between technology and our minds. And you can broadly think of that as neurotechnology. And when you say the word neurotechnology, I think to the extent that anybody knows what it is, they think of some device that's implanted into your brain, that you have some inability to speak or to move or, have epilepsy or something like that that would lead to electrodes being implanted in your brain, but they're not thinking about everyday technology. But now people are really much more familiar with wearable devices like an Apple Watch or a smartwatch or a smart ring that tracks biometric activity and picks up things like heart rate variability or temperature of your body and, can predict things for women like their likely time of ovulation or likely menstrual cycle based on all of that data. They're less familiar with technology that puts sensors that pick up brain activity. And brain activity can be measured in a number of different ways. The most common for wearable devices is to measure electrical activity in the brain. So as you think, as you do anything, as you're tired, the neurons that are firing in your brain give off tiny electrical discharge. And because there are hundreds of thousands of neurons that are firing at the same time, there are patterns of electrical activity in your brain that can be detected by something called electroencephalography or EEG. And just like heart rate can be detected through the skin, so too can this electrical activity be detected through the scalp or even as parts of brain activity like motor neurons leave the brain and go down your arm to your wrist and pick up, the firing of neurons that tell your hand to move or to type or swipe. And so increasingly, there are products on the market that pick up that neural activity, whether it's through a forehead band or headphones that have sensors that pick up the electrical activity or a watch that picks up not just heart rate variability, but also the neural activity at the wrist. And so I have been writing about that for a long time and talking about this kind of coming age of widespread neurotechnology. And when I first started writing about it, and talking about this coming age of where even our brains could be surveilled, I think, most people within academia said that these are kind of scarecrow arguments. You're kind of putting up a scarecrow and attacking it. It
Right.
doesn't really exist. It's not a real problem.
This is a
Uh,
journalism problem too. They don't like you to you can't cover threats that haven't taken form yet.
that's right. And in
Predicting
academia, it's sort of
future threats.
like
Yeah.
how is this useful, right?
Hmm.
And, and I had lots of early examples of it, but it's, one company here, one company there, not a big and wider spread issue.
Well, and you also, I mean, you have an undergraduate degree in biology, and then you did advanced study in biology, right? You were
Right.
on a whole other path once upon a time before you became a lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been really deeply interested in behavioral sciences, and so I studied genetics and in particular behavioral genetics, and then I focused the same on behavioral genetics and neuroscience in a master's degree, and was trying to figure out where I wanted to go with it all. Like, did I want to be a medical doctor? Did I want to go into law and do intellectual property law? I was always interested in these issues, but not sure how to blend them.
Yeah.
And over
How did
time,
you make that? How did you make that transition from sort of like, oh, this is neat to, oh, this is something everybody needs to know about for ethical reasons?
well, I mean, so it started where when I was getting my master's and was reading about the intersection of behavioral genetics and in crime, that people were
Hmm.
studying genetic differences between criminals, I thought, okay, this is really interesting. I want to study it more. And so I went to law school thinking, I'll study this issue, not necessarily that I would disseminate it more broadly. I ended up doing my doctoral dissertation on the intersection of behavioral genetics, neuroscience, criminal law, and philosophy. And by the end of all of that, I started to become really passionate about starting to publish some of that work and to get that out there more broadly, not just for the issue itself, but for the lens it gives us into a broader societal issue. So if we
Hmm.
think about privacy and we think about, what the impact is of people not having privacy in their actions or in their movements or in their speech, it's pretty well studied to understand the effects, the chilling effects that has on people,
Hmm.
on societies, on, kind of self-formation. But very few people have really thought beyond that to say, well, like, what if we could literally decode what you were thinking? What would the
Mm.
implications be for the chilling of internal speech? What would the implications be for, how we think about our interactions with the state or with each other? What would it mean for our ability to even kind of form self-identity? And those were the issues to me that were really interesting that it provided. And then as the technology advanced, it became much bigger and more substantial threats. And now, all of the major companies are in on this, from
Mm.
the major implanted companies like Neuralink from Elon Musk, that are racing ahead with developing implanted neurotechnology, to companies like Apple and Meta making huge bets on integrating brain sensors into everyday technology. In which case, these are not theoretical questions, they're very real questions. And we've done terribly with protections against personal data in every other context.
Right.
This
Right.
I see as kind of like, this is it. This is our last frontier of what it means to be
Mm.
human. And that's, of course, led me to the much broader set of questions of how do we think about the impact of technologies on our brain, not just from being able to decode what's there, but manipulate and change what's there.
Mm.
And with the kind of takeoff of generative AI, and seeing how people just offload so much to these technologies and divulge so much of what's in their minds to these technologies, I'm increasingly concerned about what does it mean for our capacity to think at all, let
Mhm.
alone the privacy of what we think about.
When we come back, we're going to talk more with Nita Farahany about not just this concept of giving over some of our thinking to these systems, but the whole notion of cognitive liberty, which is a concept that she came up with. Stay with us. So in your book, Battle for the Brain, The Battle for Your Brain, you talk about cognitive liberty. And I think sort of as to sort of approach that concept, you've used this term a couple of times, and it's one of my it's one of my favorite terms that comes out of the law, because I think it's such a smart and interesting way of thinking about things. But you kept saying the word chilling, the chilling effect that
Mhm.
something has. And as a legal scholar, give us some sense of that, right? We're talking about a thing that has an effect on behavior, even though it isn't actually in any legal way acting on behavior. There's no real prohibition being enacted here or any laws or rules being put into place, but there's an effect on behavior. Tell us about sort of what is the chilling effect of being monitored all the time?
Yeah, the chilling effect is people being afraid to speak up or speak out for
Mm.
fear of the repercussions of doing so. So let's take like a really easy, real example right now. I'm a university professor, a lot of university professors are really afraid of what they can say or do right now at a moment when higher education is being targeted for defunding and for disaggregation between what's happening in the federal government and what's happening at universities. And you see this effect, right? So, like with the prohibition against DEI initiatives on campus, people proactively are afraid to speak in the language of DEI, or professors who, had different components of DEI in their syllabi, for example, proactively scrubbing from their syllabi any mention of anything having to do with bias or discrimination, and then being afraid in public settings to speak their mind about how they feel about particular issues. Suppose somebody's really passionate about DEI issues. They're afraid now in any public setting to say anything about it, not because there's a law that targets them from saying anything, but because they're afraid of what will happen if they do. And you can see that in many different settings. So most of my extended family lives in Iran. And
Mm.
many years ago, I was visiting with some of my first cousins in Iran. And I remember we're in a car in traffic. And I was asking them something about what they thought about, the current regime, and what they thought about, their, like, we were going to a party, and uh, usually inside homes, people don't wear the headscarves. And so they take them off when they're out of public settings and in private settings. So I'm asking them about that. Like, do you worry about that? And they say, shh, 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 shh.
Mm.
And I said, what? And they're like, don't talk, right? So they're signaling don't talk. And why is that? Because they're afraid that there might be listening devices in the cars, or they're afraid to ever speak up against the regime and what their perspective and their views are. This is the chilling effect. Like, when you have broad-based prohibitions or broad-based fear of the repercussions of a regime, people self-regulating what they say or what they do in conformity and in fear of what will happen if they don't. And you see this in many different contexts across society. There's a lot of studies that show what the effect of chilling on speech is, of different prohibitions or even just threats. And I worry about not just the chilling of speech, but the chilling of thoughts when people feel like they have to self-regulate. And I give an example
Wow,
of
you'd
that.
be in a place where, right, to use your example in Iran, your relatives there in the future world that you're thinking about, in which an Apple Watch or whatever it is, right, puts a monitor right up against you.
Right.
You're worried about a world in which they stop not just saying it, but actively keeping themselves from even thinking about it because they're worried that that would somehow be monitored.
Yeah. I mean, just like take an example, which is the way AI is used with a lot of the video cameras that I was talking about that are in every street corner is it's not like there's a person watching every video camera at
Right.
every time, but
Right.
there are patterns of activity which are being sought after, right? So do you see, convergence in a public square that's happening, and certain kinds of movement are associated with the likelihood of a riot, and in which case, then for a place that has that kind of surveillance in place, they would dispatch a whole bunch of police or, other military into that area to prevent any kind of demonstration from occurring. And so similarly, if, people are wearing brain tech at all times and you're looking for signals of, anger or protest or particular words that could be, kind of alerted to, that kind of constant surveillance would lead people to try to make sure that their thoughts are not wandering in those directions if they know that any of it could be either used, interpreted, or misinterpreted and used against them.
So, I mean, for people who may be rolling their eyes at the idea that people are actually able to read thoughts, and they're thinking, okay, come on, like, tell us how close to reality is that, and how plausible is it, the idea that your thoughts are in some way being read or could be read in the near future?
So full thoughts and the way we think of thoughts, we're not that close, in the sense that like you have an inner dialogue, which is not intentionally communicated speech, that we're kind of a good, I mean, I don't even want to give predictions anymore with how
Yeah,
quickly
right,
AI is going.
exactly.
We're not there
Exactly.
yet, is
Please
what I'll
don't.
say,
Right,
right?
good, fine, fine. Not this
Um,
quarter.
Not
Yeah.
this quarter, likely, right? But the thing is, and what I try to go through in my book is, based on current technology, there is enough that can be read and that is being read and decoded that it already is a risk. So take brain states, which is just like your fatigue level, or take your anger or unhappiness or frustration. Already that can be used and has been used in different settings, like in China, where state factory workers are required to wear technology embedded in like a hard hat or a helmet or a train conductor hat. Their fatigue levels and emotional levels are being tracked throughout the workday, where performance and discrimination based on their performance,
Right.
or based on their emotional reaction to something is being used against them, or children in educational settings where their fatigue levels or their mind wandering is used to punish them in Chinese classrooms. Or even, there are reports of, for those state workers who have that kind of brain monitoring, flashing up things like communist messaging and then seeing whether the reaction is positive or negative from the person who's wearing that technology. Those are the kinds of things that can be and are being done today. And then intentionally communicated speech. So like when you form words, it appears in your motor cortex in your brain. And that intentional formation of speech that you want to communicate outward, that can be decoded with pretty high degree of accuracy at this point.
Do you know if does that carry over to the motor function of writing? If you were to be writing
Yeah,
something
so
in
some of it,
silence?
that's what some of the implanted neurotech has looked at is like handwriting and being able to decode like intentionally forming handwriting. But we're intentionally trying to decode, like if you imagine typing, then decoding what the imagined typing is rather than the actual typing itself. And you could see how that could have really positive use cases, like you want to send a text message and you're driving, it would be a lot better to think about sending your text message than
Sure.
picking
The
up your device
convenience.
and typing it out, right?
Right. Sure. 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 You are articulating something that I struggled to articulate. I tried in my book, but I think you do so much of a better job of articulating too this concept that like it isn't so much that they have to be perfect at reading your states of mind. It's just that they have to have it be reliable enough that they can use it as a filtering mechanism for control and reward and punishment. So like for me, I kept trying to say to people, it's not that that AI is going to be great at this stuff, but it's going to be just good enough that your boss can use it
That's right.
against you.
That's right.
And it feels to me like this is sort of you articulate this better than I do because yeah, it's like it doesn't matter that they can't read your specific thoughts, but they have enough data in the aggregate across employees to associate this signal with this outcome. And so
Right.
they can use that as a way of rewarding or punishing you.
And I think part of the power in understanding that is it's very easy for a scientist or technologist to dismiss your argument if you say, oh, well, we can't really read your thoughts. Like,
Right.
and so this whole business about mind reading is just nonsense. And when you counter with what the real technology can do and
Mm,
understand the real limitations of that technology and still explain that, yes, within all of the limitations, here are all of the things that can and are happening with current technology, it's much harder to dismiss that. And
yeah.
and so for me, it was really important to be very careful in the book about acknowledging the limitations of the technology and not
Mm-hmm.
overselling what it can and can't do, but to then confront people with, and despite all of those limitations, here's how it is already being misused and
And
how we
and you
can
have
see
like
how it can be.
you have like 1,000 companies or something that is that do I remember that number correctly? Like you talk about like it's a lot of companies that
It's
are
a lot of
actively doing
companies.
this. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a
yeah,
lot
they're
of companies.
actively
This is
doing this.
not,
That's
this
right.
is no longer a scarecrow, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Well, and this is why. So I feel like there should be this idea of a chilling effect is so powerful as a result because even if they don't get it perfect, and
Yep.
even if there's only even if we're talking about a straw man in some sense, it turns out it only takes a straw man to affect people's behavior in a
And think
really
about
big way.
children, right? I mean, like
Yeah, right.
you have children who it's not like they fully understand the limitations of the technology. Like one of the things that we love about children is their broad imagination. And so you start
Mm,
putting a device on a child's head and tell them that you're monitoring them or that the state is monitoring them within a classroom. Like what effect does that have on the development and the trajectory of a child?
yeah,
I think it's
right.
much easier for people to understand, like, who cares what the technology can or can't do? Do that to a kid and just understand what the impact is on their ability to fully
Yeah,
form a self.
yeah. So you in the book, because I want to get to this concept of sort of losing the ability to think overall, which is
Yeah.
I know the subject of a new book you're working on. But before we get there, let's do cognitive liberty. So
Yeah.
this is where I really just respect the hell out of your work is that you think so
Thank you.
clearly about possible solutions to this, and you're my training is all about branding the problem, but you have branded the solution in this case, I think, really well with cognitive liberty. So tell us a little bit about this idea that you could somehow enshrine a protection against the kind of effects that you're talking about.
So first of all, don't undersell your work because
Well, I
I mean
appreciate that.
the loop
Thank
is
you. Thank
fantastic and it's only because there's great work like yours where I can build on the foundation of people already having really well described the problem and raised public consciousness about it that I can then think about, okay, well, so what can we start to do about it rather
Well,
than,
thank you,
spending
Nita.
as much time doing that. But I
Appreciate
just
that.
I'm putting that out there just to say like
Thank you. Thank
let's
you.
undersell
Appreciate
the
that.
value of doing that. But
Right, right.
given that work, it what I've been focused on in part as a law professor has been thinking about what are the legal frameworks we need? And the next book moves beyond legal frameworks. But in this first book, it was really, okay, what can we do? And for me, it's thinking about not just neurotechnology, but all of these technologies that interface with our brain and mental experiences to say, if we think about what liberty meant before the technological revolution, before this kind of information age, liberty, was about your ability to, have freedom within the world, to not have unnecessary state intervention. But what does that look like in this modern era? And I think an update to the concept of liberty is the need for cognitive liberty, the right to self-determination over our brain and mental experiences, which is both a right to access and use technologies that can give us information about our own brains, can enhance our mental experiences, but it's also a right from interference with our mental privacy and our freedom of thought. And so I track that in this book. This concept of cognitive liberty is like a guiding principle, an organizing principle to think about what are the rights we need to update and map that to international human rights law and say, there is this right to self-determination in international human rights law, primarily understood as a collective and political right. I think we can expand our understanding of that to include a right to individual self-determination. There is a right to privacy, and included within that, to me, is the right to mental privacy, which is a right against, interference with and inferences about the automatic processes in our brain, including our mental states. And then freedom of thought is already recognized as an absolute human right, but it's primarily been applied for religious and political beliefs, and I think we need to expand our understanding of that as well to safeguard against interception, manipulation, and the reason I start with mapping that to international human rights laws, one, this is a global issue. But two, I think that gives us the powerful language and norms we need to start to reset our understanding of individuals and our relationship to technology and to say, there is this framework we need that then translates into laws and practices and industry standards and individual practices. But it's in kind of the way you described it, it's the naming and framing that I think we need. And so cognitive liberty seeks to really name and frame the solution set that we need.
Well, and as you describe it, and I'm sure people listening to this are having the same experience, like as you describe these fundamental ideas, I feel like I find myself thinking, aren't there laws about that already?
Yeah.
This
There
is sort
should
of the
be, right?
There should be, right? Because
Right.
it's so clearly you should be private in your thoughts.
Right.
And clearly you should be free of interference in that. And yet
Our
it's
laws
like
just
when
didn't contemplate that world, right?
yeah,
So, I mean,
they never thought that'd be necessary. This is
Right.
why the originalist stuff makes me so crazy in legal scholarship, where they talk about how it should be exactly as the founding fathers
Right.
imagined. And you just go, are you kidding me? Like, do you have any idea? Like, they would have a coronary if they
Right.
saw what was going on in the world right now. That's
Yeah.
right. They'd have no ability to process it. And so for me, it's so smart, I think, to try to re-articulate this as a new concept, because once you put a name on it, then people are put in the position of saying, "Oh, you mean that doesn't already have a name?
Yeah.
That isn't already a law?"
Right.
It's true for me about the data privacy stuff. Whenever you tell people about data privacy, they go, "Oh, you mean there's no law about that at all?" And you go, "Yeah,
Right.
there are no laws about how Meta gathers data on you. Nothing."
Right.
Other than what makes you upset and makes you walk away as a customer. That's it,
Right.
So that's great. Okay, good. When we come back, I want to talk now about the next phase of Nita Farahany's research, thinking now just not about our specific relationship to technology, but how technology is affecting our ability to think entirely. Stay with us. You were in this human rights and legal framework thinking about this stuff, but now it sounds like you are moving into a much bigger, broader set of considerations. Like, how did you get to the end of your last book and then realize that this was the next one you wanted? Maybe summarize it for us first so that I don't get ahead of us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so let me answer it first and then I'll summarize, which is,
Okay.
In presenting the first book, much like you said, wait, we don't already have rights. And of course we need that. Then the next question people ask is, okay, well, until that gets adopted, what can I do, right? How do I enable my cognitive liberty? How do I enable the cognitive liberty of my children? And I already had some answers to that question based on the research that I had come across in developing the first book. But I found that the two pieces that were really missing for people as the next steps were, one, how do we really define self-determination in individuals? How do I help you understand what that actually means? And there's a whole big body of research around the concept of self-determination that people have developed over time. And then the second is, what are individual practices that people can do to cultivate cognitive liberty? How do we safeguard it in the next generation? Because it's really important to have the laws and the norms. I don't think that ever we could just have individual practices and we shouldn't put all of the burden on individuals. But there also are
it
things
makes
that
me,
people,
yeah, nothing
yeah,
makes me crazier than when, multi-billion-dollar technology companies, which, employ the greatest minds in behavioral science to do their bidding,
right.
say that you and I should get more digitally literate, and that
That's right.
somehow that will be the way to fight back. I just
Right.
go, oh my God, are you
Which is
kidding
why
me?
for me it was really important that I start with the rights framework and to say, okay,
Mm.
there are like a set of sticks and a set of norms that we need to really be pushing back against. But then that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do within the limits of understanding that these are big, powerful technologies, right? It's very hard to understand and to take individual action against them. But so what I did in this book is it's three parts. The first part really focuses on describing how individual self-determination is being eroded through our interaction with existing technologies. And that is not just things like neurotechnology, but increasingly the way that generative AI, that we're using generative AI and that is being designed and deployed.
I just
And
saw, just to point out, like Sam Altman the other day, founder of OpenAI, was just talking very proudly about how so many, and I see this on TikTok all the time, how so many young people are using OpenAI
yep,
as a kind of counselor, a personal guidance counselor.
right,
For, make plans for me for this project,
right,
not just for a project, but like for my personal growth
right,
in this, that, or the other. And he keeps boasting about things that make the hair stand up for
right,
me.
totally, right. I mean, I hear it and I don't think that's good. I think, oh my God, like, do you understand what that means to individuals? And so I mapped kind of cognitive liberty to self-determination theory and break it down on three dimensions, which are the kind of thinking about our mental agility, which is skills like critical thinking and our ability to have discernment when we encounter new information. The second category is around interoceptive skills, which people are far less familiar with. This is the connection between our mind and our bodies. Like if you have a sense of your own heartbeat, or even things like your hunger cues, or when you wake
Hmm.
up in the morning and you need to go to the bathroom, those are the connection between bodily signals and our cognitive processing and understanding of them. And that's really breaking down
Interoceptive, that's that word?
interoceptive. Yeah,
That's
it's
a
like your
good
sixth
one.
sense is your interoceptive
Wow.
capabilities.
Yeah.
And that one is one that I think people are very unfamiliar with, and it's one that there's a lot of research that is developed in this space. And like if you have a child and you see that when your kid is on their, mobile device and they're on it for a while, and then you take it away from them and they're like, oh my gosh, I need to go to the bathroom, or they're super crabby because they haven't
Right.
noticed their hunger cues. It's the
Right.
disconnection between like when your brain is projecting itself into a virtual world, an
Hmm.
out of body experience in many ways happens. And so you lose sense and touch with your own body. And especially with kids, those skills are getting weaker and weaker over time because they're not developing in them the same way that adults have. And then the third category is around relational skills. And this is our ability to relate to each other. Humans are deeply social and relational beings, and our like individual liberty exists in relationship to others and into societies. And that too is very easy to see how that's eroding. Like your example of Sam Altman talking about, outsourcing what would typically be something in conversation with a friend or a therapist or,
A
oneself.
diary.
Yes. Outsourcing that to, a computer system is really interfering with relational capacities. And we see that with the cyberbullying and with the, all of the studies that show through social media, the rise in disconnection between individuals' face-to-face reactions and realities and otherwise.
Nita, I went on a trip with a friend of mine, single friend of mine, and he let me drive his dating apps
Oh,
while we were there.
yeah.
Holy jeez. Like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I did not come away enthusiastic about the future of human relations.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
an
No,
unhappy
I
experience.
hope that I stay married forever and never
Oh
enter
my God, that
into
was my number one
like,
thing. I came home to my wife and I was like, hold me. I'll do
yes.
anything you ask.
Yes. Like, let's just make this work, honey, because I never
Yeah,
want to
oh
enter
my
into
God,
that world,
please don't make me go out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
But
That's
so
funny.
part two of the book really focuses on how do we rebuild those capacities and why are those capacities so important for human flourishing? And
Yeah.
then part three builds around this concept that I'm calling the cognitive commonwealth, which is like, even if an individual is doing really well with their ability for self-determination, if the environment that they're interacting with is entirely polluted, right? If the air you're breathing is so toxic, it doesn't matter how good you're doing, right, individually in your body, that really matters as well. And so it's the collective action solutions that we need to restore our capacity to have this shared foundation for humanity. And so it looks at, part one also looks at kind of the collapse of what I'm calling the cognitive commonwealth. And part three is about how do we rebuild that and what are individual actions we can take each to rebuild, and why do we each have like a stewardship responsibility to do that? And so it's about that.
Are you finding in the research with part one, with sort of identifying the problem, that there's pretty solid evidence now of the degradation of
Yeah, I mean,
thinking
so
overall?
honestly, the hardest part is parsing the science on cognitive offloading. So, it's very early days of understanding the impact of cognitive offloading to generative AI systems. They're different in kind in that it's not just like a task-specific issue that people are offloading, like GPS or, memory in storage of, on a document or on your hard drive. It's general purpose offloading where
Right.
planning and executive functioning is being offloaded. And most of the studies aren't measuring that right now. They're measuring things like how well does somebody perform on a test.
Well,
And
this is
people
the
are
thing.
doing
How would
better
you
on
even,
tests,
yeah, how
right?
would you even do it? I don't even know
Well,
how
you could
you would.
measure executive functioning and you could look
Right.
at, so I worry about, you know, the ability to form an outline or an article or a plan of what you're going to do on an itinerary. That requires a different kind of functionality. It is like that general purpose capability that you use for executive functioning. And like almost every cognitive offloading study is either looking at self-perception of learning or it's looking at how well you do on the test or both. And people are doing better on tests and generally are stagnant
Right.
on learning. So there's a gap there. But that doesn't tell the full picture. And we don't have enough research. Like we are, the giant unconsented to experiment of what happens when humans offload their capacity for executive functioning and self-directed planning.
Right. Right. I think about this. There was a study I read at one point that was, it was a big pharmaceutical company that was using AI to create new compounds, and they gave a sort of, there was like a purpose built sort of generative AI system that they gave to like 1,000 researchers, and it became a really interesting sample size because they could really look at like who adopted to it well and who did this, and when you look at
Right.
it from a task accomplishment perspective,
Yep.
great success.
Right.
Big stratification between the people who used it well and those who didn't. Some who didn't wound up wasting a lot of time and various things, but it was sort of that was normal kind of technology adoption stuff. But the little footnote that jumped out at me was the people who were using it incredibly well and it made them really effective, the top 1% of power users, reported deep unhappiness with the job.
Yeah.
They didn't like doing the gig
Yeah.
anymore. And
Well, I
like,
mean, there's all kinds of research for a long time that has shown like automation boredom that happens, right? Pilots, when there was a shift from, flying planes themselves to
right.
automation, job satisfaction went down, boredom went up, mind wandering increased. So,
Yeah.
automation, like there's a lot of research you can draw from to try to show the picture of what's likely to happen, but hard science on what happens when we offload general purpose cognitive capabilities, like there is nothing on that because we've
Right.
never done that
Is
before.
that good for society? Talk about a
Right.
straw man that you can't really get
You
your arms
can't, I
around.
mean,
That's
you
right.
can't. So I can show what the impact we know is. Like we know what the Google effect has done on memory. People no longer remember things, they remember where to find things, or the photo impairment effect, which is people don't remember their experiences of like their children's birthdays anymore. They are because the encoding of the memories is reduced by taking pictures of it. Or and the emotional experience is reduced of actually having experienced or been there. We can look at some of the early cognitive offloading, like GPS and spatial awareness, and how that's eroding over time. And then we can imagine what it means to offload our executive functioning, right?
Yeah.
If you can see
Right. Right.
atrophy in each of those different areas, you can imagine that there is going to be atrophy in that area as well. It's
We've
not that
seen
hard
the
to
movie.
extrapolate it. Yes.
Yeah, right. We've seen the science fiction version of that
Yeah.
enough times, presumably to know that that's not a good thing, that we shouldn't be aiming for that. That's right.
Right.
And yet here we are, watching
it happen, watching the train wreck.
Watching it happen.
Yes.
Watching it happen. I know. You've always
Watching
been
it
much
happen and then watching people like post about how great it is that people's
Yeah.
self-perception of learning is increasing. And you're like, that's such a narrow metric of what's
I
actually being
know.
offloaded here.
Do you feel like your sort of opinion of the folks making these systems and marketing these systems is changing as you get into this stuff? You used to be you were much more level-headed about it than I was. I became pretty reactionary pretty quick.
I mean, the truth is that I think that a lot of the technologists in many ways just have blinders on. Like it's not like I don't think badly of them. I think many of them are trying to do things that improve humanity, and that they just like that's not their skill set to think about the broader implications and how to safeguard against it. Like they are so optimistic about the possibilities of the technology that they're introducing that it's hard for them to truly take a more balanced perspective and say, okay, what could go wrong and how do I make sure that the best version that I have envisioned is what the reality is that actually is put in place. And their incentives are not aligned to do that.
That's right.
Like
That's right.
Their incentives are aligned to be the first to succeed rather than
to ship.
Yes.
That's right.
And so I don't blame the technologists behind it. It is a system that we have developed that we all subscribe to that enables a kind of race that puts humanity and our interests second to the, rapid advancement of technology. So
Right.
I think I'm still pretty level-headed in that way. But
yeah, good on you.
I wish they would do better.
I know.
So
I know. I just wish it were somehow in the training.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking about this. I'm pursuing a book about sort of basically like great ideas we should not pursue is the working title, and I've been looking at like different examples in which people have shown either restraint in innovation or taking responsibility for innovation before it gets out in the world, right?
Yeah.
And their whole. So I've been looking for like parallel places, and one of them I was bumping into is what happens when an architect builds a building that requires special equipment to clean.
Yeah.
It's considered like a big sin kind of in architecture. Like if you build a thing that conventional cleaning apparatus can't deal with.
Yeah.
Like it used to be, you'd kind of admire that dude, because it's inevitably a dude, for, doing something really crazy. But now people look at it and say, no, that's not cool. Like you weren't taking adequate responsibility for the outcome. These days architects are responsible for the entire life cycle of the building. They think about how the building is going to fall apart and that it will do so in an ecologically responsible way. If you transported that over to how people who are shipping, going from concept to funding to shipping in 9 months. Yeah. It's
your example just made me think of like USB-C and the shift, like, to just different, like making entire technologies obsolete. Does that include like ship us back every one of the, original USB cords that you had, and we will recycle them and have a plan for that? And
that's right. Exactly. Well, when we come back, I want to get to this notion of the cognitive commonwealth. What is it to actually create a safe space for all of us? We will be right back. Let's talk about the cognitive commonwealth, this third idea that you have. I don't want to make you give away all your solutions from the second part of your book, but I really want to get thinking about the cognitive commonwealth. I've been thinking a lot these days about, like, one concept I keep coming back to is this notion that I really want to make lying expensive again. Like it's free right now, and it is so rewarding for the people who engage in it at this cultural moment, because we just have for some reason lost the infrastructure that used to punish dishonesty. And so I've been trying to think about, like, what are sort of technology tools we could use to try and do that? What's a way of creating kind of a network of expertise in which, if you're included in that network, you're considered a more credible source than if you're not. Like, I'm sort of playing around with these ideas and thinking about maybe building some tools around it. But what you're talking about with the cognitive commonwealth is this feels connected to this. It's like, I really like what you're saying, that it doesn't really matter how healthy you are and how good your choices are if the environment is polluted. So like, I think we can probably all imagine, now that you've described it, what it is for the individual when thought is eroded by these technologies and our ability to make good decisions and think for ourselves is eroded. Help us understand in the aggregate what the effect is over time, and then how you would imagine a cognitive commonwealth being a
Yeah.
solution to that.
So I mean, I think of the cognitive commonwealth as already existing, right? It is all of the information systems that we access. It is all the stories we tell. It is the books we write. It is the institutions that we build. And if you look, each of them are weakened, right? So if you want to go and do research these days, it's very difficult to know if the information is real or false, right? If you and you want to learn about something, right? In good faith, you want to go and learn about some new topic. And, half of what you encounter is AI generated content, which hasn't been source checked, which is, half of it based on false information, or it's people who believe in conspiracy theories and have promulgated that and amplified it in ways that are deeply problematic. You want to know if it's safe to give a vaccine to a child. And so you go and you start to do research, and there's so much out there that's confusing. As a diligent parent, you don't even know what to do. You're in many ways paralyzed by the information that's there. And so what I start to do is to show what the dimensions are that really have eroded in the cognitive commonwealth. And what are some of the efforts that people have put into place and that we can participate in to start to reverse that, and why we each have a duty to do that and have a stewardship role in actually restoring this common source of knowledge and of humanity. And so, there are some examples that I use, like collective fact and source checking kinds of initiatives. So PolitiFact is a good example out of here at Duke that Bill Adair does, or V-Taiwan was this really neat verification platform where citizens participated together to try to help amplify credible information. And once you start to develop a reputation for being a source of credible information, it's like when people go to Scopus and try to figure out if something is a false or a true narrative to find out the truth behind information. Those are initiatives that help to start to restore trust and faith in common sources of information, because if we don't have any shared truth, it's very difficult to have any shared anything. And so it's, how do we find that truth again? And how are we part of the solution to have there be such a thing as real facts that we can rely on, and real truths that we can rely on, and real authenticity? If you don't know that you're interacting with a bot or a human, it's very easy to fall prey to deception or to not have trust in your interactions that you have online. So how do you start to restore some of that trust that you have online? So it proposes a number of both collective solutions that we should be investing in, but also what we as individuals can do to contribute to those and to lead in those efforts to restore not just our individual thought processes, which is, incredibly important, but, to both be contributors to the cognitive commonwealth and recipients of a restored cognitive commonwealth.
So I had Renee DiResta as a guest a few weeks back. She's an internet researcher. I'm sure you know her. And she was making a really interesting
She's had a
point
heck of a time, hasn't she?
She is.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand how anybody in the public sphere operates in that world anyway. And when the researcher is female, it is so much more horrific. I just don't. Yeah, I don't know how female experts in that stuff get out of bed in the morning. This was true at NBC. The colleagues of mine who reported on internet stuff, and then would just face this incredible harassment that I never experienced as a male journalist. So anyway, she is tough as nails. And so Renee was talking about. She was talking about a similar sort of the same sort of concept here. How do we get back to a place in which we can sort of trust the world, basically trust the information in front of us? And one thing she said that I wonder what you make of is that she doesn't believe any longer that there should truly be a global town square. That the notion that was first pushed by Facebook and is now sort of everybody's idea, that there's going to be this kind of like global commons, really just is kind of marketing. It serves the purposes of the big company that wants to do that, but that she says from a cultural and political perspective, it makes no sense, because we've never really had that before, and we don't share enough like we're not, there's no universal set of values, universal set of whatever, and so we should, she thinks, have bifurcated pockets of community and information and so forth, so that
I think that's
and that
probably
would,
right to
what do you
some
think about that?
extent,
Yeah.
right? Which
Yeah.
is like, I really value the local fact checking kinds of initiatives because you're far
Mm,
more likely to trust your neighbors who are collectively part of, a
right.
kind of information verification. Like that relational autonomy piece is so important to so much of what we do as humans. But that shouldn't preclude us from thinking about norms that should exist within platforms that are global, like Meta, right? So the idea that there is some platform where information can be amplified globally should require that there be some norms within that community about the veracity of facts and, what happens with badging when you're interacting with a chatbot and, basic ideas that should be the kind of floor for
Mm,
that. But maybe as we think about what our cognitive commonwealth is and the sources of informations that we internalize, we should be looking for sources closer to home that can be verified or
mm,
people closer to home that we can say, oh, that's a real person who's publishing that
yeah.
information. That's not some distant person who I don't know, who I have no idea what their intentions, their motivations, their
Hmm.
like whose payroll they're on to disseminate that information is.
Yeah, right. It's interesting. It reminds me there was a writer for the New Yorker years and years ago named A.J. Liebling, who was their guy could write about anything. He was their boxing critic for a time. He was a food critic, and as a food critic, he absolutely hated the rise of the Michelin Guide. The
Hmm.
Michelin Guide to him was a nightmare because he said you could once upon a time you would go to the whatever the restaurant was in the town in some French village, and the food you knew was going to be excellent because the same people are coming every night. And if it
Uh-huh.
slips at all, they're going
Uh-huh.
to give hell to the chef. And so you knew the food could be great. But that the Michelin Guide created an opportunity for Parisian weekenders to drive out to a place they'd never been, eat at a restaurant once, and never go back. And he said it gave rise to a whole kind of mediocre cuisine designed for these day trippers. And it's that thing of like, yeah, I love local intelligence, right?
Mhm.
I think that's absolutely right. And yet I'm not sure that I want local intelligence for vaccine information.
Right.
know?
Right.
Like I think there are some universal, like scientific universals, right? The Enlightenment was supposed to give us the opportunity to arrive at some universal expertise that we could all draw on. And
But you
so
might trust the local doctor who's sharing the information
mm,
about the vaccine. You would hope that there is a commonality of truth, right? That you're
right,
not like, if you visit one doctor, you're going to get the same answer as if visiting the next doctor
right,
about, right, the
right.
risk benefit profile. Um, so there's a difference, I think, between the nature of the information itself and the source that you receive it from.
Yeah. Do you think that achieving a cognitive commonwealth requires that we push back against the ability of people to make money in the way they've been doing over the last couple of decades in this, creating of these big polluted environments? I mean, for me, one of the big
Yeah, I mean,
lessons
I think that there
yeah.
has to be some look, like I started with law, I will end with law, right? Which
Mm,
is I don't think this is possibly something that should or that we should want to be all on the shoulders of individuals to carry forward and to
yeah.
fix. And, it has to be in relationship with effective governments and with effective institutions. But we can each play a part in restoring those institutions. And I think we each have to play a part in restoring those institutions. I don't think that we can leave it to the few people who are leading the tech companies or the few people who are in charge of government to come up with those solutions without a groundswell of political will that shifts them in that direction.
Yeah.
So
Nita
in
Farahany.
many ways, what I want to do is restore to people the belief that they can play a part in the solution.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. There is so much, it serves the purposes of these, of the people trying to do wrong or make money off the wrong things to feel helpless in this situation. I think that's absolutely right. And so, yeah, restoring some autonomy. I really like that. Nita Farahany, thank you so much for being here on The Rip Current. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.